This is part 2 of our rhetorical situations and their constituents. And part 2 will talk about how Grant-Davie considers audience as part of the constituents from rhetorical situations. So to begin this section, Grant-Davie primarily introduces primary audiences and secondary audiences. So primary audiences are those who the discourse is intentionally for. Secondary audiences are those who are in passing, those who may benefit partly, those outside the discourse, and so on and so on. So if we take this example of this lecture or this video, if I put it on YouTube, my primary audience is, of course, intentionally my students or you all who are the viewers of this video because you need it for this class. However, I need to take into consideration as well when I put it in a space like YouTube, when I put it out there to the public in the way that I do, I may have secondary audiences that I may not realize. So those secondary audiences could be other students who are in technical writing classes, those readers of the article that I'm teaching from, or even just passing YouTube videos of viewers, who came across my video just randomly. So there's, of course, primary audiences who this lecture is for, which is you all, and then there's a good bit of secondary audiences as well. So as we said in part 1, Grant-Davie works a lot from Bitzer, and he cites Bitzer when he talks about audience and Bitzer says, audience exists fairly simple as a group of real people within a situation external to both rhetor and the discourse. So what Bitzer is saying here is that audience actually has nothing to do with the rhetor or the discourse. They exist external or separate from you as the writer, but also the conversation as well that you're trying to introduce. So audience is as if it's its own little sphere. However, Grant-Davie doesn't really like Bitzer's definition, and rather he takes Douglas Park's definition of audience, which Park separates into 4 parts. So the first part is any people who happen to hear or read a discourse. The second, a set of readers or listeners who form part of an external rhetorical situation. So this is actually equivalent to Bitzer's interpretation of audience. The third, the audience that the writer seems to have in mind. And then the fourth, the audience role suggested by the discourse itself. So here we see Park breaking down audience in 4 different ways. So there are 4 different viewpoints of how to view audience. The first one, any people who happen to hear or read a discourse. So that's literally anyone who passes by, anyone who may come across your project, anyone who may come across your discourse or conversation or read it. The second, a set of readers or listeners who form part of an external rhetorical situation. So like Bitzer said, this is an audience who may be flagged by the discourse. They exist outside of the conversation of your project, but they're flagged in a way that brings them to your discourse. The third, the audience that the writer seems to have in mind. So, of course, we have real audiences, but there's imaginary audiences too. So you as a writer are writing to an imaginary audience. You don't actually see who the audience is for your projects, usually. Not everyone, but there might be some imaginary audiences because you don't know exactly who will come across your project or who exactly you may be writing to. You don't see the actual people. And then the fourth, the audience role suggested by the discourse itself. This one's actually a really cool one to think about audience, because when you write, when you compose whatever discourse you are making for your project, you are creating an audience as well. So you, as a rhetor, not only are you thinking about an audience that you have in mind, like the third one, but what you compose in your projects also suggests the type of audience that you are inviting. So one way to look at it is, from what I am making, from what I am composing, from what type of conversation I am starting in my project, what type of audience am I suggesting would actually listen to this conversation, will actually view my project. So another way to break this up is Grant-Davie actually looks at Eade and Lunsford and cites them and says that audience addressed is for 1 and 2. So audience addressed can be identified as any people who happen to hear or read a discourse, or a set of readers or listeners who form part of an external rhetorical situation. So these are real people, real audiences. So that's audience addressed, those who you are actually addressing. And then there's audience invoked, those who you are invoking. What Grant-Davie identifies as parks 3 and 4, the audience that the writer seems to have in mind, and the audience role suggested by the discourse. So that's another way to see it, or divide those 4 parts into 2 parts, by audience addressed and audience invoked. So audience addressed is actual people. Audience invoked, it comes across the line as to an abstract audience, as an imaginary audience, as what you, as the rhetor, as the writer, as the composer, make up in your head, either through the project or discourse you create, or in your own mind before you actually start creating the project. And then we have Grant-Davie said, I would suggest that the third resides not so much in the text as in the writer before and during the composing process, while the fourth is derived from the text by readers. So let's take this apart. So he would suggest the third resides not so much in the text as in the writer before and during the composing process. So the third, when we think about the writer coming up with what audience they imagine this discourse to invoke, right? This is what Grant-Davie is saying, that the writer is the one who creates this audience, not the text, the writer. However, the fourth one, the audience role suggested by the discourse itself, the fourth one is derived from the text by the readers. So the fourth, the audience themselves create this type of role that they play from your discourse that you create, from the text that you create, from the projects that you create. So here we see the audience actually playing a role, creating a role for themselves from the discourse or project you created. So an audience actually has a lot of agency when reading your finished product, because the fourth, audience role suggested by the discourse itself, the fourth is something that the readers or the audience creates for themselves. What type of audience are they imagining themselves to be from the work that you've written? So instead of asking who is the audience, Park recommends we ask how a discourse defines and creates context for readers. And this is something that I want you all to ask yourselves as well as you are working through your rhetorical analysis for my class about your projects. So now I want you to consider who is the audience, right? I want you to consider who is the audience addressed. But I also want you to consider, how is this discourse defining and creating something for readers? Who is it defining or creating? What type of audience is this discourse creating? What type of audience is this project creating? So our discourse, our projects, creates a nature of audience. Although it's still abstract, although it's still thought up, it's still something to really consider, because that gets you in the shoes as a writer, as a rhetor. It puts you in the shoes of other people. And when you're in the shoes of other people, you can write better to them. if you know what type of audience you're writing to, you'll be able to make the right moves in your writing. You'll be able to prioritize what is important in your writing. And the roles of rhetor and audience are dynamic and interdependent. So rhetor and audience have to exist and depend on one another. They can never be separated. We can talk about them separately, but a lot of questions that we'll ask and a lot of questions that you will ask in your own rhetorical analysis will overlap. Rhetors may invite audiences to accept new identities for themselves, offering readers a vision of not who they are, but of who they could be. So I love this quote that Grant-Davie has. So as writers, as composers, or as what Grant-Davie identifies us as rhetors, when we create our projects, when we create our discourses, we are inviting our readers, our audiences, to envision themselves as a type of audience. So we actually invoke or help them to see who they could be. Could they be helpers? Could they be aides? What type of audience are you creating when you create your project? And what do you want your readers to do? Not only what do you want them to identify as, or what you want them to feel like who they are, who they could be, but what do you want them to do? Is there an action? And how does that action define what type of audience they will be? So if your goal is to create an infographic to help domestic violence victims know how to safely dial a hotline, what type of audience does that mean you want those people to be? If reading is a rhetorical activity too, then it has its own rhetorical situations, reading situations, which may have their own exigence, roles, and constraints. So here we have another point that Grant-Davie is making again, that reading is actually a rhetorical activity too, that audiences have a responsibility too to the text that they are engaging with. When you write or when you compose your projects or whatever you are composing, whether it's in my class or in your community partner or even as your careers progress, I want you to really deeply consider that you are not just writing to an empty vessel. That if you get anything from this video, you're not writing to an empty vessel. You're not writing to empty minds. You are writing to people who have experiences. You are writing to people who do have open minds. You are writing to people who may change their mind about something. You are writing to people who have their own goals, who have their own identities, who have their own exigences. So keep that in mind anytime you write, and always consider that. What type of audience am I trying to invoke or address? What type of audience am I trying to address, firstly? So who my audience is. And then what type of audience am I trying to invoke? Meaning, what type of audience am I trying to create? Who can my audience be? What am I trying to inspire my audience to be? Who am I trying to inspire them to be whenever I make this project? Consider this when you start really diving into your rhetorical analysis, and it's going to take a lot of thought. It's going to take a lot of thinking. So go ahead and start thinking about that. That is the end of part 2, rhetorical situations and their constituents for audience. We'll talk about part 3 in our module 3.